Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm happy well, I don't need to say that I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to see new faces also in Sankt Ignatios, like your face, even though it's not new anymore, but it's still a Ukrainian face, and it's very, very good that there is a continuation, a Ukrainian continuation in the school. I need to apologize for tormenting you on this sunny day. I know that Swedish people don't work on the sunny days, and they shouldn't. That's why they work all the year, except some days like this one. But bear with me. In my presentation, I will start quite early. Let me go back to 1686. The year when a bunch of documents were promulgated by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Well, the most known document from this bunch annulled the most important document in this bunch actually delegated the Moscow Patriarchate to the right to consecrate the Metropolitans of Kyiv at the time, which was interpreted by Moscow as the acquisition of the Metropolitan of Kyiv, and interpreted as the kind of passing the rights of ownership over the Church of Kyiv to Moscow. Of course, it was not the original intention of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The intention was just to delegate to Moscow the right to consecrate the bishops for Kyiv Metropolitan, and only in the case if the new Metropolitan of Kyiv who was elected was not a bishop, which was a common practice. Nowadays, we are accustomed to the situation when someone who becomes a primate of the church is elected among the bishops, which is a canonical abnormalcy. The normal practice is when someone who is a priest is elected to a senior position of the Metropolitan, and then that person has to be consecrated to be a Metropolitan. Otherwise, if a bishop is elected to the Metropolitan of Kyiv or any other metropolia, that means metathesis, the transferment of a bishop from one see to another, which is a canonical problem. So only in the case when a person who was elected the Metropolitan of Kyiv was not a bishop, only in that case Moscow had to interfere and to consecrate a bishop for the See of Kyiv. That is the most debatable document in the entire bunch of the documents. But I'd like us to concentrate on another document, less known in the same bunch of documents, promulgated in 1686. It's titled On the Conduct of the Election. In Greek, it is Epitogenesthetin eklogin, how to conduct the election. The election of the new Metropolitan. And this document is very interesting and illuminating, and I believe it's quite prototypical for the entire Orthodox world, which is not really acknowledged and appreciated by the Orthodox world. So this document says that first of all, the Metropolitan of Kyiv should not be appointed. No one has an authority to appoint a Metropolitan, neither the Patriarch nor another Metropolitan, no one else. A Metropolitan should be elected. And he should be elected by everyone, all the people who belong to his diocese, to the Diocese of Kyiv. And it says, anti-eparchia tavti ipokimeni. Everyone who is under the Diocese of Kyiv should participate in the election. And the document goes even more specific about who is to participate in the election. And it explicitly says it should be bishops, archimandrites, abbots, hieromonks, married priests, monks, and lay people. So end of the 17th century, and the norm of the election of the new Metropolitan of Kyiv, which was even before 1686, of course, and the letter of 1686 just confirmed this practice, was that everyone, including lay people, actively participated in the election of the new Metropolitan. This was an unusual practice. It was not common. Within the same Ecumenical Patriarchate, it was not possible. The lay people could not participate unless they were fanarios, unless they were like officials in the court of the sultans. But otherwise, any ordinary peasant, any ordinary citizen could not participate in the elections of bishops anywhere else except in Kyiv, in on the territory of hetmanate. And basically, we could say that this practice was a sort of a model for what we now call the local council of the church, поместный собор, when bishops, priests, monks, laypersons participate actively in the election of a new primate of the church. And it's interesting, this letter of 1686, explicitly states that this tradition, synethia, is good and in accordance with the canons. In Greek it is kali ke kata kanonas epikratises asynethia. So it's a good practice, canonical practice, which was confirmed by the document of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So it's not democracy, it's not Protestantism, as they would call nowadays. It's a normal canonical practice of the church. Later on in Ukraine, we came to call this practice as sobornopravnost. We coined a term, which should belong to the lexicon of conciliarity. We talk a lot about conciliarity nowadays, and I would say that this practice of election of the new Metropolitan of Kyiv is an intrinsic and essential part of this conciliarity tradition in the church. It's very early, and it's very conciliar. It's very synodal, with a very active lay participation. Late 17th century, imagine, when the Enlightenment just started in Europe. The ideas of emancipation just began, and in Kyiv, they were already a tradition, an established tradition. Then, what happened then? Soon after 1686, this was kind of a step of annexation, basically, of absorption of Ukraine by the Muscovite principality. And it ended up in the complete kind of submission of Ukraine to Moscow. And this led to the situation when this old tradition of electing the primate of the church by everyone faded away. I have a hypothesis, my own suggestion, that Constantinople explicitly stated the way how the Metropolitans of Kyiv had to be elected in order to protect this metropolia from emancipation, from assimilation in Moscow. It was one of those instruments of protection of the self-sufficiency of the Kievan metropolia, like, for example, another demand in the letters, that the Metropolitans of Kyiv must commemorate first the Patriarch of Constantinople and second the Patriarch of Moscow. So Constantinople created a mechanism, basically, to protect at least somehow the sovereignty, the independence of the Kievan metropolia from Moscow, knowing what will expect this metropolia in Moscow. And Moscow knew that if Moscow preserves this sobornopravnost, this synodality within the Kievan church, and allows it to exist, it cannot completely consume the Kievan church. The only way to consume the Kievan church would be to replace this mechanism of synodality by electing the metropolitan with a new mechanism of appointing a metropolitan, appointing someone who would be the head of the Russian church. And basically, Moscow achieved its goal by annexing the Kievan metropolia through the practice of appointing the metropolitans, through changing the practice envisaged by the letter of 1686, which envisaged exactly this lay participation of everyone in the election, with the practice of appointing someone. And actually, this practice of appointing the primate of the church continued until recently. The last appointed primate of the Kievan church was who? Who knows? It was Filaret Denisenko. He was the last one who was appointed in the Moscow way, following this Moscow practice of annexation of the Kievan metropolia. After him, everyone else was elected, basically. Again, and not just appointed by Moscow as an exarch. Philaret was appointed as an exarch. These traditions of election, when people elected their church leaders, existed not just on the level of the church, of Kyiv Metropolitan. It existed also on the level of the dioceses and even parishes. Through the 19th century, approximately the middle of the 19th century, people continued electing their priests in their communities. One of the prominent kind of Ukrainian figures in the Ukrainian culture, Ivan Levitsky, he was a son of a priest himself, and he was a writer. He was a participant in the movement of emancipation of Ukraine from the Russian Empire. He actually described and through the literature, the way how communities, how parishes existed in Ukraine, and he emphasized that communities relied very much on the election of priests by the communities as such. So this tradition of election somehow continued, and we see how it made its way even to Russia. In Russia, Peter I, Romanov, actually what he did, yes, I mentioned this bunch of the letters, 1686, right? One of the letters from this bunch of the letters from the Ecumenical Patriarchate was sent also to Peter when he was a co-tsar with his elder brother Ivan Romanov, who was kind of incapable a bit, a person with challenges, and perished, disappeared from the historical scene. Peter survived, and basically this absorption of the Kyiv Metropolitan into the Russia, to Moscow Church, was a conclusion of the process of creating a Russian Empire, because the Russian Empire needed to be, in order to be an empire, it needed the legacy of the Third Rome, of Constantinople, and needed the legacy of Kyiv. It needed actually both identities, both legacies of Constantinople and of Kyiv, of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, Ecumenical Patriarchate, and the Metropolitan of Kyiv. So it actually managed to get this legacy, this identity, to absorb this identity under Peter I as a young co-tsar with Ivan Romanov. But when Peter became older, grew up, he decided he doesn't need this legacy of Moscow the Third Rome, and he doesn't need the legacy of even of the Kyiv Metropolia. That's why he, for example, he abolished the idea of the Patriarchate, because Patriarchate was another component in this empire identity, right? To be a true continuation of the Neo-Roman Empire, of the Byzantine Empire, one has to have Roman identity and the Patriarchate. So Peter had it all, and he got rid of it eventually. He abolished Patriarchate he did not allow to re-elect the new Patriarch after Patriarch Adrian died in 1700. He also moved his capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg. He abandoned the idea of Moscow the Third Rome. Instead, he created the idea of Moscow as the Fourth Rome, because St. Petersburg is the fourth Rome. Why so? Think about this. The clue is in the name. Peter, St. Peter. St. Peter. It's like the claim, it's the city where Peter was the bishop. Of course, right? So it's Rome. St. Petersburg is Rome. It's like the old Rome. It's not the new Rome. It's the old Rome, and therefore it's Fourth Rome. It's not the new Rome, because Moscow was new Rome, right? It's the Fourth Rome. So he adopted this idea of St. Petersburg, which was actually hit by the Ukrainian drones, blessed by Ukrainian drones today, which is kind of revenge, because we say that St. Petersburg was built with the Ukrainian labor force, and now Ukrainian labor force challenges it. So Peter abandons the idea of the Moscow the Third Rome. Instead, he adopts the idea of Moscow the Fourth Rome, and Peter reshapes the church. The church was always a very important part of the legitimacy, imperial legitimacy, of building the identity of a new political entity as what the Moscow Principality was. And his new empire, he declared actually Russia as an empire in 1721. In the same year, he established a new church, basically. He reshaped the church dramatically. It was, I call it the patron Reformation. It was a proper Reformation. It was a Reformation which can be compared with the Reformation of Luther, in a sense. Not theological necessarily, even though theological element was also there, but it was in the sense of creating new structures of the church. Maybe it was even more like Calvinist Reformation, in a sense. Because he reshaped completely the leadership of the church, the idea, the structure, the leading structure of the church. He abolished the Patriarchate, and instead he established what he called Духовная коллегия, Духовный collegium, spiritual collegium. Actually, it's interesting, in the original documents, those who know, he has named it, and I actually read the original document with the hand notes of Peter on that document. Collegium is used in the neutral gender, anno collegium. He calls it anno collegium. Okay, and this spiritual collegium was to replace the Patriarchate completely. And it's interesting that instead of the primate, we don't know, we've forgotten this, instead of a primate, a new institution, a new position was introduced, a president. And it is stated in the original document that a new president, he calls it president, the president of the collegium, is to manage the matters of the church. And it very clearly also stated, and I quote the document that established the church, the very title of president is not a title of pride, for it means nothing other than chairman. Neither he himself nor anyone else may think highly of him. So the purpose of Peter was to diminish the meaning of this presidency as low as possible. Basically, it's like Presbyterian almost model of leadership. So there is a president who is the primate of the Russian church, and he's just a president. He presides over, nothing more than that. The first president of this collegium was elected, who else? Of course, a guy from Galiciana, not from Volyn, I'm sorry. It's Stefan Yavorsky from Yavoriv, who was at the time the Archbishop of Ryazan, and he was a very close confederate of Peter, and Peter just picked him up to preside over the council and to be the president of the collegium. And there were two vice presidents, just like in Sankt Ignatios, vice deans. And one of the vice presidents of the collegium was who? Feofan Prokopovich, another Ukrainian guy, who actually constructed the entire system. He invented this, but not from the scratch. He used this egalitarian synodal system of the Kievan Metropolia. So even though on the one hand Moscow absorbed Kievan Metropolia and changed the model of how the metropolitans were elected, changed the synodality of Kievan Metropolia, it adopted this model into its own constituency, new constituency, which was called the spiritual reglement, Духовный регламент. Very soon, this spiritual collegium was rebranded to sound more traditional, more orthodox, as the Holy and Governing Synod, Священный правительствующий Synod. So it was kind of synod, not collegium, because collegium sounded too Protestant. And Yavorsky, especially Yavorsky, he said, well, it's not appropriate, it's not pious, let's call it somehow else. Let's call it synod. Peter said, okay, if you insist, let's call it synod, but still it was collegium in essence. It was a Protestant sort of even Calvinist body of governance. So that's how a synodal system in the Russian church was established. It was appropriated by Moscow and now by St. Petersburg from the Kievan Metropolia as a model. And itself, it became a model for all other autocephalies in the 19th century across the Balkans. The first example of this new autocephaly became the Greek independence, the Greek autocephaly, which was proclaimed by the Greek Church in 1833. One of the key figures in the Greek autocephaly was a guy whose name was Adamantios Korais. He is believed to be the father of the Greek Enlightenment. He was sent on the scholarship to study in France, in Montpellier, the scholarship which was paid by a guy whose name was Makarios Notaras, the guy who actually created Philokalia. He composed Philokalia. He just took different manuscripts, put them together, and he created Philokalia. He is proclaimed as a saint in the Greek Church. And he also subsidized Korais to go to France and to study theology. And Korais initially studied theology, but then he moved to science, to medical science, and he became like an intellectual, quite secular intellectual, father of the Greek Enlightenment, and actually he described autocephaly as he wanted it. For Korais, the Ecumenical Patriarchate was the evil. It was the worst thing that could happen to the Church, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, because it was connected with the throne of the Sultan, and the Sultan was tyranny, he was a tyrant, it was the source of evil, and everything that touched this source of evil became polluted itself. And Korais actually used the word pollution. So the source of pollution is the Sultan, the High Port. And then the Patriarchate of Constantinople, because it was so closely connected with the Sultan, it was polluted already. And everything that was in connection, canonical relationship with the Ecumenical Patriarchate was polluted as well. So basically, Korais wanted to create a kind of a sanitary zone around the new Greek state, which had to be independent. In order to preserve its integrity and moral purity, the Church had to separate itself from the Ecumenical Patriarchate. That was the idea of Korais, and he was an idealist. He was, I found the closest figure of Korais in the Ukrainian recent history. It's Yevhen Svestyuk. He had the same kind of idea that Moscow Patriarchate is the evil. So stay away from the Moscow Patriarchate, because in this way you can preserve your moral integrity. The same arguments that Korais expressed in the beginning of the 19th century against the Ecumenical Patriarchate, Sevryuk expressed against the Moscow Patriarchate in the end of the 20th century. There was another guy, Theoktitos Pharmakidis, archimandrite, who also is an author of the Greek autocephaly. And he also believed that the Greek Church needs to stay away from the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Ecumenical Patriarchate is evil, but he had his own reasons. He said that in order to become a nation, a proper nation, the Greek nation has to stay away from the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So for him, the idea of autocephaly became a prerequisite sine qua non to become an independent nation, a true nation. So the nation building depends on autocephaly, meaning on getting away from the Ecumenical Patriarchate as far as possible. They also agreed, and actually all of them, and Korais and Pharmakidis, agreed that the autocephaly needs to rely on the horizontal relations. It needs to have very weak leadership, no patriarchy, no strong vertical relations. It needs to rely on the horizontal participation, including the lay people. That's why in Greece emerged a phenomenon, an institution which is called clerico-laiki synelevsi. It's like a congress of clergymen and lay people, which decided the matters of the church and the matters of the state. And the possibility of such congresses were preconditioned by the possibility of autocephaly for the Greek Church. So they proclaimed autocephaly. Pharmakidis basically said, we don't need any permission to have our autocephalous church. We don't need any kotomos, any recognition. Basically, he said what Philaret said in the beginning of the Ukrainian independence. Autocephaly is not something which is given, it is something which is taken. That was the idea of Pharmakidis. And At the same time, while they wanted the leadership of the church to be weak, they wanted the political leadership to be strong in the church. They wanted actually the state to play a key role in the church. And the Declaration of Independence of the Greek Church, which was issued in 1833, stated also that the church is run by the synod, but the key role in the synod is played by the king, which is exactly the model of the spiritual collegium of the Russian church under Peter I, which was brought to Russia by the Ukrainians. So we see how the Ukrainian model of Kievan Metropolia through St. Petersburg goes to Greece and creates a new paradigm of church governance and autocephaly in the Greek church. Later on, the same Greek model became a model for other autocephalies. First of them was the autocephaly of the Romanian church, which was initiated again by the ruler of both Moldavia and Wallachia, Alexander Cuzu. There was a trick how he was elected. The big powers, the big players, including the British Empire, of course, did not allow Romania to become a single state. But they were okay with both Moldavia and Wallachia, two principalities under the Ottoman Empire, to be more or less independent. So the Romanians tricked the Brits. How? They elected Alexander Cuzu as the head of both Wallachia and Moldavia. And then the big powers realized, okay, you tricked us, what can we do? We can do nothing, so let it be. And this led actually to the unification of the two states, of Moldavia and Wallachia. Later on, Transylvania joined them, and they became Romania. They also become a single church. And in 1864, Cuza, as now the ruler of both Moldavia and Wallachia, issued a document which he called Decretul Organic pentru, and so forth in Romanian, so the organic decree, which was a law that declared that the Romanian Orthodox Church is and remains independent from any foreign ecclesiastical authority in all matters concerning its organization and discipline. And its general synod, Synodul General, became its main body that also represents its unity. So Cuzu essentially established a general synod. And this synod consisted not just of bishops, but also of priests and lay people. It was like spiritual collegium in Russia, and very much like Kievan Metropolia in Kyiv. It was this general synod. So it was a very kind of horizontal, with a very strong participation of the lay people, very emancipatory institution in the Romanian church. Of course, in the synod, the role of the ruler was important. So he had like a veto right in the synod. He sent the Minister of Culture of Romania at the time, was his representative, like Oberprocuror in the synod, and he could veto any decision of this synod. So on the one hand we see, and this is like a model now, on the one hand we see a very weak leadership in the synod and a very strong political influence on that synod. So the Romanian ruler, for example, appointed all members of the General Synod, according to the Article 15 of this general decree, and could veto any of its decisions. All synodal decisions took effect only after the ruler's approval. So we could, I could write you, could draw for you a scheme now. So on the one hand, we have like, can I write it here? Yeah, I can. So here, the starting point is Kievan Metropolia, which had this, as Constantinople said, good and canonical tradition of everyone's participation in the election of the Metropolitan. Very egalitarian, very lay model. Okay? Then it moved to Moscow, or to St. Petersburg, where the spiritual collegium was established by Peter I. I put it like Peter I. His reforms. And remember, the Ukrainians were those who designed everything for him. They essentially brought the model of Kievan Metropolia to St. Petersburg and established the Synod of the Russian Church. Then this model became a model for Greek autocephaly. 1833. For the Synod, which also encompassed lay people and priests, and I should also mention that the Greek Synod also included in the beginning lay people and priests. And then the Greek model became a model for first Romanian church, and then later on Serbian and Bulgarian. All the Balkan autocephalies were modeled according to the image and likeness of the Greek autocephaly. Serbian and Bulgarian. All of them, all those models were very egalitarian, relied on the lay participation, on the participation of the priests, so everyone in the church, and featured a quite weak church leadership and a very strong political influence. That was the model. You will ask where it will lead. Of course, it will lead back to Ukraine. Because this model returned to Ukraine in the beginning of the 20th century, when the Ukrainian People's Republic was established and a new autocephalist movement started in Ukraine. And this autocephalist movement was based exactly on these models. If we look at the writings, I just want to quote one passage from Alexander Lototsky. Lototsky was a minister of religions in the Ukrainian People's Republic that existed from 1917 through 1921, basically. Lototsky was a key figure in this in the institutionalization of the Ukrainian autocephaly. And that's how he envisaged this autocephaly. I quote, the fundamental principle of Ukrainian state authority is that an independent state must have an independent church. That's exactly Pharmakidis' point. This is equally demanded by the interests of both the state and the church, which is Kuza's statement. Kuza also believed that the church is a pillar of the state, of the statehood, of the Romanian statehood. Which later on in the Ukraine situation, the closest person to Kuza I find is Hetman Skoropadsky. Petro Skoropadsky exactly had the same belief about the crucial importance of the church as a pillar for the state, for the statehood. No government that understands its state responsibilities can agree to the center of ecclesiastical authority being located in another state. This is even less permissible in the present case, given the fundamental differences between the two states, both in terms of their political regimes and regarding the legal and state status of the church in Muscovy and in Ukraine. Well, he calls Russia Muscovy, which is the proper name for it. Therefore, in its relations with other structures, the Ukrainian church must be autocephalous under the leadership of the Metropolitan of Kyiv and in canonical communion with other independent churches. Next point is important. As for the relationship between the church and the state, that relationship must be based on an unshakable foundation, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's, which is quite a departure from both Greek, Romanian, and Bulgarian Serbian model. Because in Serbia, well, in Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece, the role of the state was crucial. You render to Caesar what you should render to God. In Lototsky's point was that you should separate the two things. They should not be confused, which was quite a thing which I think would go closer to this model than to those models. And another point, the independence of the church will help give expression to those social forces that have shown such extraordinary initiative in our former national life. social forces, meaning everyone. Exactly this egalitarian social model that, that Kievan Metropolia had. This statement by Lototsky and basically this ideology of autocephaly in Ukraine in the period of the Ukraine People's Republic, I could describe in the following way. I will remove this one, this picture, and we'll draw another one. Probably some of you know that I like to represent the relationship between the church and the state as a triangle, like this triangle. There is the church here, state, and society. And this triangle describes all the complexity of the church-state relations, right? In this sense, in the case of the Ukrainian autocephalism of the beginning of the 20th century, in the words of Lototsky at least, I could redraw this scheme. For him, basically, the church is autocephalous, right? The state is a republic. It's important. It's a republic. It's not just monarchy. It's not like monarchy like was in Greece when autocephaly was proclaimed, or in Serbia and Bulgaria where there were monarchies. It is a republic. And the society is civil. So we can speak about the civil society already then as a part of this autocephalist movement. And again, it's a result of this long journey, the previous picture, starting with the Kievan Metropolia through the Balkan autocephalists back to Ukraine. But of course, in Ukraine, not everything was so easy as it is always like that. Because this autocephalist model of Ukraine, in Ukraine, faced the challenge of whom? Who is the main challenge in the church? Bishops, of course. The challenge of bishops. No one among the bishops wanted to support it. They refused to give a consecration to the elected Metropolitan of Kyiv. So in 1921, at the Council of the Autocephalous Church, Ukrainian Autocephalous Church, they elected a metropolitan from a priest, as it should be. Remember, I said, it's not normal when a Metropolitan of Kyiv is elected among the bishops. It's canonically normal when it is, usually in the, before the 17th century, they were the archimandrites of the Kyiv Church. That was usually the case. Almost by definition, the archimandrite of the Kyiv Church would be elected as metropolitan. But still, there were elections, real elections, not fake elections, you know. They elected a priest. Well, he was a married priest at the time, Vasily Lepkivsky. And they wanted to consecrate him as a bishop, as it should be, and everyone refused to help. Then they went to Constantinople. Constantinople said no. They went to Georgia, to the Church of Georgia, just like Sankt Ignatios, and Georgia said no. They refused to help either. And they decided to do a very radical thing, to consecrate as a bishop, Metropolitan of Kyiv, only by priests and lay people, with no bishop's participation. Yeah, that was a very radical step, but it was in the spirit of emancipation. It was very organic for the Ukrainian autocephalism. In which sense? In the sense that everyone has to take part in it. If someone refused to take part in it, like bishops, well, it's worse for them. And there was an argument by a prominent figure, Chekhyvsky, who was a priest, and he was actually a prime minister in the Ukrainian People's Republic for some time. He suggested, like, follow the Alexandrian. We are now in the Antioch room. We should have had it in the Alexandrian room. Let's follow the Alexandrian model, when priests, presbyters participate in the election of the new archbishops of Alexandria. Of course, it was a wishful thinking. It was an overstretched interpretation of the Alexandrian practice, because the presbyters participated in the election of the Archbishop of Alexandria, but did not actually consecrate the Archbishop of Alexandria. But with Lipkivsky, they decided that we will do the consecration as well. And what happened in St. Sophia Cathedral, they just gathered together, and lay people put their hands on the shoulder of the priest. Priest put the hand on the shoulder of another, of the next row of the priests, and eventually the first row of the priests put their hands on the gospel, and the gospel was put on the head of Lipkivsky. Well, in Ukraine, this act was called samosvятство, self-consecration, which is a wrong term. For the first time, this term was used in the 13th century, when there was an attempt of Ukrainian autocephaly under Prince Iziaslav, when Klim Smolyatych was elected by the prince and promoted as the Metropolitan of Kyiv. His people whom he consecrated were called samosvyati, the self-consecrated. It does mean that he didn't have a proper canonical consecration. He had. And this term, samosvyati, was transmitted to Lipkivsky. And this is wrong, because samosvyati means I consecrate someone by my own, which is basic for autocephaly. And basically we could say that all the autocephalies, at least in the 19th century, were self-consecrated, samosvyati, because when they consecrated someone, they didn't ask the Ecumenical Patriarchate to do so, but they were bishops still. So bishops who consecrated other bishops without the permission of the Ecumenical Patriarchate were samosvyati, but they were bishops. And this term was wrongly attributed to Lipkivsky, because Lipkivsky was consecrated not just by the decision of the council, but without the participation of the priests, of the bishops. It should be called somehow else. I don't know how. And this became a problem for the Ukrainian autocephaly. On the one hand, this step was intrinsic for the Ukrainian autocephalist movement, which was very horizontal, very emancipatory, was very much about the lay participation, the participation of everyone, about conciliarity, synodality, in the sense as we understand it now. Now we still dream of synodality that was already practiced like in the 17th century in Kyiv. But at the same time, this emancipation went so far as they actually consecrated someone without bishops. This became a stigma for the Ukrainian autocephalist movement. And this stigma was manipulated. Everything, since then, it has become a custom that every single kind of attempt of autocephalism was called samosvyatstvo. Like, for example, when in 1990, in June 1990, there was a council of UAPC, Ukrainian Autocephalous Church in Kyiv, which established the Autocephalous Church and elected as the Patriarch Mstislav Skripnik, who was he was still in the United States, and they elected him as the first Patriarch of the Ukrainian Church. When this council gathered, Filaret, at the time, the exarch of the Russian Church, started kind of publishing and calling this council as the gathering of samosvyati, of aventurists, you know. So he applied this pejorative term of samosvyati, self-consecrated, to Mstislav Skripnik and others, even though they were not samosvyati anymore. Because in 1942, what happened? The hierarchy of the autocephalous church was completely restored to the canonical normalcy. In 1939, a part of Volyn, the Holy Volyn, was occupied by the Bolsheviks. And later on, it was occupied by the Nazis, by the Germans. At that time, it belonged to the Polish Orthodox Church, which was autocephalous already, according to the Tomos of 1924. And some, bishops in Volyn region, they decided to switch to the Moscow Patriarchate. The primate of the Polish church, Dionysy Walediński, disagreed with this. He said, this is my church, and you grab it from me. This is like stealing my parishes just because of the occupation. He disagreed, and he decided to re-establish the autocephalous, Ukrainian autocephalous church in Volyn, in this area. He did not establish his own jurisdiction, Polish jurisdiction in Volyn. He knew it was dangerous. Yes, we all know about Volyn. And that's why he decided, and also he didn't want to establish a new church. He didn't have authority to establish a new church. So he decided to revive the old autocephalous church, which had been established in 1921. He established UAPC, Ukrainian Autocephalous Church, but he knew the problem of hierarchy, of consecration. And he decided to re-consecrate everyone, every bishop who served there, or to consecrate new bishops. He delegated this to Polycarp Sikorsky, to his bishop, and together with others, Sikorsky practically renewed the autocephalous hierarchy in Volyn. And that's how the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church was renewed and re-established in Volyn. And then after the Soviets reoccupied Volyn and the rest of Ukraine, they moved to the west, to Canada and to the United States. And then they came back in 1990, and they elected Mstislav. Mstislav Skripnik was consecrated as a bishop in the same time by Polycarp, not by Polycarp Sikorsky, but the bishops who were consecrated by Polycarp Sikorsky. Anyways, he belonged to this 1942 hierarchy of UAPC. I know it's complicated. So there are two versions, two models of UAPC, Ukrainian Autocephalous Church, Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. One version is 1921. This is Lepkivsky. This is no bishops to consecrate other bishops. And then WAC version 1942 with the participation of Sikorsky, Walediński, when the bishops were consecrated properly, but the institution, the church, was reestablished. And then it was reestablished again in Ukraine, the third version, in 1990, at the council in January 1990, when Mstislav Skripnik was elected the first patriarch. I still don't understand how they decided to elect the patriarch there. I still don't get it, because it was really an adventure. It was done without the consent of Mstislav himself. So they just told him, "You are now our patriarch." And he said, "What? I didn't ask you to call me the patriarch," because he was just a metropolitan. And it is very natural for the Kievan Church to be metropolia. And that's one of my points, my kind of suggestions, that it's natural for Kievan Church to be metropolia and not to be a patriarchate, actually. Because to be a patriarchate is very much a Moscow model of governance, which was actually brought at this council in 1990, and then supported by Filaret, because he wanted to be a patriarch anyways. And he brought this Moscow model to the Ukrainian church. In the same year, 1990, a new church emerged, which was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Orthodox Church. Yes. It was established in 1990 by Filaret Denisenko because he asked Moscow to do so. After he lost elections to the Patriarch in June 1990, and Alexei II was elected the Patriarch of Moscow, Filaret decided, to have his own church in Ukraine. And in October of the same year, he had a council when he established a church which he called Ukrainian Orthodox Church. He asked for a blessing from the Moscow Patriarchate, and the blessing was given. Alexei II himself brought a special letter of recognition to Kyiv. That's how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate as we call it now sometimes, was established at that time, even though it was established as the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Then Filaret, quite soon, decided to. He was here. He was the head of this church. Then there was a council in Kharkiv that got rid of him, And this church continued without him, and instead he decided to create the patriarchate on the basis of this church. He actually took the title of the patriarch as it was adopted by this council in June 1990, and he merged what remained of the UOC that stayed with him with what a part of UAOC that wanted to be with Philaret, because this church had very much allergy to Philaret. They really hated Philaret. They really believed that Philaret is this patriarchal model, this kind of autocrat that is against the spirit of autocephaly. And if you read, for example, the writings of Sverstyuk, Yevhen Sverstyuk, he writes, just like in the spirit of Korais, that the autocephaly is a way of preserving the church's purity, is the way to preserve morality, and is the way to preserve the horizontal relations in the church. He believed that Mstislav Skripnik actually encompassed those virtues, and he believed that Philaret did not encompass those virtues. That's why a part of the UOC decided to stay on its own. Yeah, comrades, are you okay? And there was a merge of the part of the UOC with the part of the UAOC, and that's how the Kyiv Patriarchate was established in 1992. And this situation continued, the three-church situation continued until 2018. When in 2018, basically, what was done was the annulment of the Act of 1686, with which I began my presentation. As I said, in 1686, the right to consecrate the Metropolitan of Kyiv was delegated, by Constantinople to Moscow. And in 2018, this right was revoked by Constantinople. They said, Moscow is not in charge of this anymore. We are back to be in charge of the Kievan Metropolia. And basically, we could interpret that in October 2018, the old Kievan Metropolia, as it existed, remember it started here, was restored. Everyone, which means that everyone in Orthodox in Ukraine, whether he or she wanted it or didn't want it, was a part of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and Kievan Metropolia. Now everywhere was Ecumenical Patriarchate, but almost no one acknowledged it and recognized it. That is our Orthodox situation. There is a reality, but we don't acknowledge it. And a part of this Kievan Metropolia, which was restored, basically, decided to have its own autocephalous church. And that part gathered at the council in December 2018, and they decided, we want our own autocephalous church. But we want it to be recognized by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And of course, the Ecumenical Patriarchate said, very well, you are most welcome, I will recognize it as a part of the Kievan Metropolia. And first they adopted at the council, they adopted the statute of the Kievan Metropolia. That statute was almost a copy of the statute of the Greek Orthodox Church. I believe that the statute of the Greek Orthodox Church is the most democratic among all other churches. It's really about horizontal relations. It's really about, emancipation. It's about participation. It's about accountability. It's about, all good things that we believe in. And the copy of the statute actually was used to produce the statute for the autocephalous church. Of course, this autocephalous church, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, later on decided to change the statute because it was too democratic for it, which is how usually things are. Then after adopting this statute, they elected a new metropolitan. At that time, the metropolitan who was elected, Epifani Dumenko, he was the Metropolitan of Kyiv under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Technically speaking, his election had to be approved by Constantinople, according to the custom. So the custom was that you, the people, you elect your metropolitan, and then you need to get approval from Constantinople. But this approval was not needed because the council was presided by the representative of Constantinople. It was Metropolitan Manuel Adamakis of France at the time. So there was no need to get approval from Constantinople, and by definition, the approval came through the presidency of the Metropolitan of France. Yes, there is a moment in the procedure of the election of the Metropolitan. I never said it, I will say it for the first time here. According to the spirit and the letter of how elections of the Kievan Metropolia happened, it was supposed to be that everyone had to participate in the election of the Metropolitan. In 2018, not everyone participated. There were two tours. The first tour, it was, yes, lay people and priests participated, but they were not really, many of them were appointed by the bishop. They were not really, it was almost like a fake, participation of the lay people. They came as delegates, yes, but many of them were picked up by the bishops. And still they were able to participate only in the first tour of election. In the second tour, only bishops elected, which is a Moscow practice. So in 2018, in December, they elected the new Metropolitan of Kyiv very much in a Moscow way, against the Kievan way, original Kievan way. Yes, that's why they hate me still in the church, because of such statements. But Metropolitan Mikhail will like it, a bishop. Yet, the Metropolitan was elected. Okay, however it happened, I believe it was not exactly to the Kievan tradition. It was kind of a hybrid combination of Moscow and Kievan tradition, but it happened. We accepted, and then this church asked Constantinople for the recognition, and that's how in January 2019 Constantinople gave a tomos for autocephaly for this church, which I believe is the basic document for the entire Orthodox Church in Ukraine, for the entire community. Now the question is, what is well, we understand what is the the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the autocephalous church, right? It has a canonical autocephaly. It is acknowledged by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. It's an independent church, and it develops as it develops. The question is, what happened to this church, which is believed to be Moscow Patriarchate? It has, I call it, I sometimes call, the Kievan Metropolitan how we call this, the cat of Schrödinger, right, in the quantum mechanics. So this is like a metropolia of Schrödinger. So we cannot really understand the status of this metropolia. It is and it is not at the same time. So this status particularly applies to this church. What is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, known as the Moscow Patriarchate? What is its status? In order to interpret the status, I use the language of the letters of the charters which were promulgated this year, 1686. Because then in Constantinople said that we give to Moscow the right to consecrate the Metropolitans of Kyiv by economia, by concession. It's not akrivia. So akrivia, the precision, Daniel knows what it is, the precision of the canons means that it is still the Ecumenical Patriarchate. But economia, by economy, it is Moscow Patriarchate. So it had already, in the end of the 17th century, this double status. By akrivia, it is Ecumenical Patriarchate. By economia, it is Moscow Patriarchate. And I believe it still applies here to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. By akrivia, it is the Ecumenical Patriarchate. It is a remaining part of the Metropolia, Kievan Metropolia and the Ecumenical Patriarchate. But by economia, it is still Moscow Patriarchate. Of course, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church does not recognize that it is either or. It says we are not Ecumenical Patriarchate, that's why we broke relations with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. We are not Moscow Patriarchate because we decided not to be a part of the Moscow Patriarchate. So they deny that they are anything of that. And I believe that they are both the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Moscow Patriarchate. You see how complicated it is. And you have to involve quantum physics in order to understand it. So that's how here we are. We are still there. But I believe these traditions of emancipation and egalitarianism and equality and lay participation are still very, very strong in Ukraine, in all jurisdictions, both in the Autocephalous Church and even in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. It's not really, it's canonically speaking, it's still Moscow Patriarchate, I believe. But in its spirit, in the way how it functions, it's still Kievan Metropolia, very similar to how it existed even before. That's where we are. And that's where how we can build relations, and actually it's just the practical conclusion from my sermon. How Sankt Ignatios can operate. It can operate exactly on this basis of the common ground of Kievan Metropolia: egalitarianism, equality, emancipation, lay participation, because it's the common denominator with all those jurisdictions. If we elaborate on this, we can achieve some success with both of them, with both jurisdictions, because that is the common ground of them. Thank you.